A filthy tourist sneezed straight onto a royal guard's face, laughing as if nothing could touch him. But when the guard finally moved, the entire crowd went silent. He had just crossed a line he could never undo. Now, before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Also, make sure to check out our second channel, Guard Patrol, linked in the pinned comments, because we upload daily at the same time on both channels. So, subscribe to both and never miss a powerful story. The crisp autumn air hung over Horse Guards Parade like an invisible curtain, lending the historic grounds an air of solemn dignity as the morning sun cast long shadows across the immaculate courtyard. The ancient stones seemed to breathe with history, each one bearing silent witness to centuries of ceremony and service. Early tourists had already gathered, their excited whispers and camera clicks a gentle counterpoint to the centuries-old ritual unfolding before them. Children pointed with wide-eyed wonder at the scarlet uniforms, while parents consulted guidebooks, absorbing facts about traditions that stretched back to times when kings and queens weren't just figureheads, but wielders of absolute power. Into this scene of practiced reverence stumbled Owen Fleming, his arrival as jarring as a cymbal crash during a prayer. His worn backpack hung unevenly from one shoulder, stained with unknown substances that had transformed its original blue into a mottled tapestry of neglect. The T-shirt stretching across his substantial midsection bore evidence of his breakfast, and possibly dinner from the night before, in a constellation of grease spots. "Move it, will ya?" Owen barked, shouldering past a Japanese family carefully positioning themselves for a photograph. He left in his wake expressions of shock and the unmistakable odour of someone who viewed daily showers as an optional luxury. Lance Corporal Richard Harlow maintained his position with the stoic dignity that 8 years of military service had ingrained in him. His scarlet tunic was a masterpiece of precision, each crease exactly where regulations demanded, each brass button polished to mirror brightness. The bearskin cap sat perfectly aligned on his head, adding nearly 18 inches to his already impressive height. 2 tours in Afghanistan had forged him into the perfect guardian, vigilant, disciplined, and capable of standing perfectly still for hours while maintaining absolute situational awareness. Had his fellow soldiers from the 2nd Battalion seen him now, they would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes, the only outward sign that he had registered Owen's disruptive arrival. The same subtle tell that had once alerted his squad to potential danger in Helmand Province now served as his only reaction to civilian disruption. "Bloody waste of taxpayer money," Owen muttered, loud enough for nearby visitors to hear as he fumbled with a chocolate bar, the wrapper falling from his fingers to skitter across the parade ground. A middle-aged woman in a sensible coat frowned and bent to retrieve it, only to recoil when Owen waved her away with chocolate-stained fingers. "Leave it. They've got people for that, don't they?" "Is that man ill?" whispered a well-dressed American woman to her husband, pressing a handkerchief to her nose as Owen passed them. Her husband shook his head, guiding her gently to a position upwind. Lance Corporal Harlow's eyes remained fixed on the precise point in the distance that regulations stipulated, his breathing measured, his posture perfect. Yet in his peripheral vision he tracked Owen's meandering approach with the battlefield awareness that had kept him alive during 2 tours in Afghanistan. "Oi, nice hat," Owen called out, his voice cutting through the respectful murmurs as he unwrapped a greasy breakfast sandwich. "Does it keep your head warm, or is it just to make you look taller?" He took an enormous bite, talking through the half-chewed food. "These tourist attractions get more ridiculous every year, don't they?" Fragments of egg and sausage escaped his mouth, landing on his already stained shirt. A British family with 2 teenage daughters edged away, the father placing a protective arm around his children. "Perhaps we should view from the other side," he suggested quietly, steering them away from Owen's vicinity. The younger daughter's face wrinkled in disgust as Owen belched loudly without apology. "Dad, why does he smell like that?" she whispered, not quite quietly enough. Owen continued his breakfast performance, licking his fingers with exaggerated satisfaction after each bite. The paper wrapper gradually unfolded in his hands, releasing more crumbs and globules of sauce that dotted the immaculate parade ground. "You must be bloody boiling in that get-up," he addressed the guard again, wiping greasy fingers on his jeans. "Or maybe you're just a statue. Let's find out, shall we?" He waved the half-eaten sandwich perilously close to Lance Corporal Harlow's face. An elderly couple, who had been quietly appreciating the historic surroundings, exchanged glances of dismay. The gentleman, his posture suggesting military background, shook his head slightly. "In my day, such behaviour would not have been tolerated," he murmured to his wife, who nodded in agreement. Owen coughed suddenly, a wet, rattling sound from deep in his chest. Rather than cover his mouth, he simply turned his head slightly, sending a fine spray into the morning air. Nearby tourists flinched and stepped back, creating a widening circle of space around him. Owen planted himself squarely in front of Lance Corporal Harlow, unwrapping another snack, a chocolate bar that had clearly melted and resolidified several times in his pocket. As he peeled back the wrapper, flakes of chocolate fell to the ground near the guard's immaculately polished boots. "You know," Owen said through a mouthful of chocolate, "I never understood why grown men would want to play dress-up for a living." He gestured vaguely with the candy bar, sending more chocolate particles arcing through the air. "Standing around all day, getting gawked at by tourists, like a zoo animal, isn't it?" The chocolate wrapper joined its sandwich predecessor on the ground, carried by a light breeze until it came to rest against the guard's boot. Owen noticed and smirked. "Oops, guess your cleaning crew missed a spot." A distinguished older gentleman in a tweed jacket observed the scene from several yards away, his bearing suggesting military experience. His companion, a silver-haired woman with equally refined posture, whispered something that made him nod gravely. "That's Colonel James Blackwood, retired," one tour guide murmured to another. "Served 30 years, Victoria Cross recipient." Owen, oblivious to the growing disapproval around him, produced a bag of crisps from his seemingly bottomless supply of snacks. The rustle of the bag opening was jarringly loud in the increasingly tense atmosphere. "So what happens if I touch you, eh?" He waved greasy fingers dangerously close to the guard's immaculate sleeve. "Do they dock your pay? Take away your dinner privileges? Or do they just make you stand in the corner wearing that silly hat as punishment?" Owen's nose had begun to run more noticeably now, a glistening droplet forming at one nostril. He sniffed loudly, wiping it away with his sleeve rather than the wadded tissue visible in his pocket. "Getting a proper cold, I am," he announced, as if sharing important news. "Picked it up on the plane over. Bloke next to me was coughing the whole flight from Manchester." Another wet sniff punctuated his statement. Colonel Blackwood had moved slightly closer, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before him. His wife touched his arm lightly, a gesture of caution that he acknowledged with a slight nod. They both understood the discipline required of the guard, having lived through decades of service themselves. "Look at him," Owen continued, performing now for anyone within earshot. "Not even a twitch. Maybe he's actually dead. Should we check for a pulse?" He reached up as if to touch the guard's face, letting his hand hover just inches away before withdrawing it with a barking laugh. He punctuated this with another loud sniff, followed by a throaty effort to clear his sinuses that made several nearby tourists visibly recoil. One woman actually gagged, turning away quickly as she pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Owen's attention fully fixed on Lance Corporal Harlow now, clearly interpreting the guard's disciplined silence as an invitation rather than a warning. He adopted a mockingly rigid posture, chin jutting forward in an exaggerated parody of military bearing. "Attention!" he barked, his voice carrying across the parade ground. "Permission to scratch my arse, sir!" He followed this with an exaggerated salute that bore no resemblance to the precision of actual military protocol. Several children giggled nervously before being quickly hushed by their parents. Owen extracted his phone from his pocket, holding it at arm's length for a selfie. "Smile, soldier boy. This one's going on my profile." He pressed himself uncomfortably close to the guard, making an obscene gesture with his free hand. Not bad at all," he murmured, tilting the screen toward the guard's impassive face. "Though you might want to work on your smile. Looking a bit constipated there, mate." The retired colonel leaned toward his wife. "That young guard is showing remarkable restraint," he murmured. "In my day, we'd have had that fellow removed by now." "Times change, James," his wife replied quietly, "though perhaps not always for the better." Owen produced a toothpick from somewhere on his person and was now enthusiastically excavating between his teeth, examining each discovery with peculiar interest before flicking it onto the immaculate parade ground. One particularly substantial fragment landed perilously close to the guard's boot. "Got something stuck right at the back," Owen narrated, digging with renewed vigour. "Might be bacon from breakfast. Or maybe that dodgy curry from last night." He extracted something unidentifiable and examined it with inappropriate fascination before wiping it on his jeans. A security officer had taken notice now, speaking quietly into his radio as he moved casually closer to the scene. His practiced eyes scanned Owen with the assessment skills of someone who had dealt with troublemakers before. He recognized the type. Tourists who mistook historical sites for amusement parks, who treated uniformed personnel as props rather than professionals. With subtle hand signals, he alerted another colleague positioned near the entrance, establishing a perimeter without drawing attention to their actions. Owen remained oblivious, caught up in his one-man show, unaware that security protocols had already been activated. "You know what I reckon?" Owen leaned in, his voice dropping to a stage whisper audible to half the parade ground. "I reckon you're dying to tell me to piss off. Am I right?" He tapped his own nose conspiratorially. "Your little secret's safe with me, soldier boy." He hawked loudly then, gathering phlegm from the depths of his evidently congested chest. For one horrifying moment, it seemed he might spit on the ground, directly in front of the guard. Several onlookers actually gasped. At the last second, he swallowed it back with an exaggerated gulp that prompted more than one witness to flinch. "Considered sharing that with you," he informed the guard with a wink. "But I'm a class act. Me." Owen's nose had begun streaming in earnest now, the cold or whatever ailment he was harbouring clearly progressing. He withdrew a crumpled, visibly used handkerchief from his pocket, examined it briefly with a grimace, then returned it unused. Instead, he wiped his nose across his sleeve again, leaving a glistening trail. The morning air had grown noticeably tense, charged with the collective discomfort of dozens of tourists who found themselves unwilling witnesses to Owen's increasingly offensive behaviour. Lance Corporal Harlow remained perfectly still, his training holding firm against provocations that would have broken lesser men. But Owen, emboldened by the guard's disciplined silence, was far from finished. "Not feeling too grand," Owen announced, sniffling more pronouncedly now. His nose had taken on a ruddy hue, his eyes watering slightly at the corners. "London weather. Gets right into the bones, doesn't it?" He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, examining the result with inappropriate interest. "Proper cold coming on, I reckon." A mother hurriedly shepherded her children away, whispering urgently about hand sanitizer and not touching anything. Other tourists maintained their distance, creating an unofficial quarantine zone around Owen and his unwilling audience of one. "You ever get sick standing out here all day?" Owen asked, moving directly in front of the guard. "Or does the Queen give you special royal germs that keep you healthy?" He laughed at his own joke, the sound deteriorating into a wet cough that he made no attempt to cover. The retired colonel had moved closer now, his military bearing evident in every line of his posture. His wife remained at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a gentle restraint against intervention that wasn't yet warranted, despite every instinct suggesting otherwise. Owen's breath came in shorter bursts now, his sinuses clearly congested. He rummaged in his pocket, producing the same crumpled handkerchief he'd examined earlier. It was visibly damp, stained with evidence of previous use. He looked at it for a moment, grimaced, then stuffed it back into his pocket. "No point using that," he declared loudly, "already soaked through." The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, his discipline unwavering, but Owen had positioned himself directly in his line of sight, impossible to ignore completely. The distance between them had shrunk to mere inches. Owen's lack of understanding regarding personal space becoming yet another offence in his growing repertoire. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Owen said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried to the horrified onlookers. "I can feel it building, right up here." He tapped his sinuses. "The big one!" His features contorted slightly, eyes squinting, nostrils flaring. Witnesses would later describe it as watching a disaster in slow motion, obvious what was about to happen, yet impossible to prevent. Owen's breath hitched, his chest expanding as he drew in air. His eyes closed momentarily, his head tilting back slightly. Every parent in the vicinity recognized the signs, grabbing their children's hands and backing away with urgency. The colonel's wife gripped her husband's arm tighter. "James," she whispered, a single word carrying volumes of meaning. "Achoo!" The sneeze exploded from Owen with volcanic force, carrying with it a visible spray that caught the sunlight like a toxic mist. He had made absolutely no effort to turn away, to cover his mouth, to direct the biological projectile anywhere except directly at Lance Corporal Harlow's impassive face. Droplets spattered across the guard's cheeks, some landing on his lips, others clinging to his eyebrows like morning dew. The sound of collective gasps from the crowd was nearly as loud as the sneeze itself. Time seemed to freeze in that moment, the atmosphere charged with disbelief and horror. Owen, far from embarrassed, actually grinned as he wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "Pardon me," he said, not sounding remotely apologetic. "Couldn't hold that one back." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the pigeons seemed to pause their cooing, as if recognizing that a line had been irrevocably crossed. In that suspended moment, all eyes fixed on Lance Corporal Harlow, waiting for a response that military protocol suggested couldn't come. But some provocations transcend protocol. Some offences move beyond the realm of acceptable restraint into territory where even the most disciplined soldier must acknowledge a fundamental breach of human decency. The biological assault on his person wasn't just disrespectful, it was potentially dangerous, a health hazard delivered with deliberate intent. Owen, misinterpreting the stunned silence as appreciation for his audacity, began to laugh, a wheezing, phlegm-filled sound that only underscored the severity of his transgression. "What's the matter, soldier boy? Cat got your tongue? Or just a bit of my cold?" The retired colonel had gone completely still, his expression hardened into granite. His wife no longer restrained him. Instead, her hand had fallen away, tacit permission granted for whatever might follow. Lance Corporal Harlow's eyes shifted. A subtle movement so precise it might have been missed had not every witness been watching with bated breath. His gaze found the captain of the guard, who had been observing from a discreet distance. A nearly imperceptible nod passed between them, military shorthand developed over years of service. "Guardsman," the captain spoke, the single word carrying the full weight of his authority. "At ease." The transformation was immediate and profound. Harlow pivoted 45 degrees with parade ground precision, then brought his ceremonial rifle to position against his shoulder. The movement was fluid, disciplined, and somehow more intimidating than any outburst of anger could have been. "Sir," he acknowledged, his voice clear and steady, despite the biological assault still glistening on his features. He made no move to wipe his face, that indignity accepted as part of his duty for the moment. Owen's smirk faltered slightly, his bravado diminishing as he realized the situation had changed. The guard was no longer a statue. no longer bound by the silence that had emboldened Owen's behaviour. Two palace security officers materialised from the crowd, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who knew exactly what they were doing. "What's all this, then?" Owen attempted to maintain his cavalier attitude. "Can't take a joke, is that it?" The captain approached, his bearing every bit as precise as Harlow's. "Sir, you have assaulted a member of His Majesty's Guard. I must ask you to accompany these officers immediately." "Assaulted?" Owen barked out a laugh that dissolved into another wet cough. "It was just a sneeze. Happens to everyone." Lance Corporal Harlow spoke then, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from actual battlefield command, rather than artificial bluster. Section 39 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988 defines common assault as any act by which a person intentionally or recklessly causes another to apprehend immediate unlawful violence. Your deliberate biological contamination constitutes such an offence. The recitation of legal statute, delivered with perfect calm despite the spatter still visible on his face, seemed to finally penetrate Owen's consciousness. The guard's voice carried the unmistakable steel of command, not raised in volume, but radiating authority that had been earned on battlefields where decisions meant life or death. Owen's cocksure expression faltered for the first time, the reality of his situation beginning to dawn on him like a cold shower after a night of excessive drinking. "Now hang on," he began, backing up a step, his shoulders hunching slightly as if trying to make himself smaller. "Furthermore," Harlow continued, as if Owen hadn't spoken, "given your obvious symptoms and the current public health guidelines regarding respiratory illnesses, your actions potentially constitute a more serious charge under the Public Health Act." The security officers had positioned themselves on either side of Owen now, not quite touching him, but clearly prepared to do so if necessary. Owen's eyes darted between them, the first flickers of genuine concern replacing his previous contempt. "This is ridiculous," he protested, his voice rising. "It was an accident." "An accident," the retired colonel spoke up, stepping forward with the quiet confidence that came from decades of command, "involves no intent. You declared your intentions quite clearly before the act, sir. There are several dozen witnesses who can attest to that fact." Owen's face flushed, though whether from embarrassment or fever was difficult to determine. "Look, I didn't mean—" "You have deliberately exposed a serving member of the armed forces to potential illness," the captain cut him off. "That alone would warrant your removal, but your continuous disrespect, littering and disturbance of the peace provide additional grounds for immediate escort from these premises." A medical officer had appeared now, carrying a small kit. With efficient movements, he began the process of cleaning Lance Corporal Harlow's face, using proper disinfectant protocols. Harlow submitted to this attention without changing his professional demeanour, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he had endured. "The gentleman will require testing," the medical officer informed the captain, his tone making it clear he used the term gentleman loosely. "Standard protocols for biological exposure." "Noted," the captain replied, before turning his attention back to Owen. "Sir, these officers will escort you to the security office. You may either cooperate fully or face immediate arrest. Those are your only options at this time." Something in his tone finally penetrated Owen's belligerence. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in, the potential consequences of his joke suddenly looming larger than his desire to provoke a reaction. This is an overreaction," he stammered, but allowed the security officers to guide him toward the exit. "I'm a tourist. I spent good money to visit this place. And we've spent centuries building a tradition of respect, discipline and service," the colonel replied, falling into step behind them. "Your money doesn't buy you exemption from basic human decency." 3 weeks later, Owen Fleming stood at the edges of a much larger crowd, gathered to witness the full spectacle of the changing of the guard. His appearance had undergone a remarkable transformation. Gone were the stained clothes and unkempt beard, replaced by clean attire and a properly trimmed face. He maintained a respectful distance from other spectators, his posture suggesting a new awareness of personal space. The court appearance the previous week had been mercifully brief but painfully clear. The magistrate, a no-nonsense woman with 3 decades of judicial experience, had laid out the consequences of his actions with razor precision. "Mr. Fleming," she had said, peering at him over her glasses, "your behaviour was not merely disrespectful, but potentially hazardous. You deliberately exposed a serving member of His Majesty's Armed Forces to bodily fluids while knowing you were ill. In ordinary times, this would warrant a significant fine. In our current health-conscious climate, it borders on reckless endangerment." The community service hours assigned to him, cleaning public spaces while wearing a high-visibility vest, clearly identifying him as performing court-mandated service, had provided ample time for reflection. His mandatory health screening had revealed not just a common cold, but a more serious respiratory infection that required treatment. Colonel Blackwood appeared beside him. "Good morning, Mr. Fleming," he said, his voice neither warm nor cold, simply acknowledging. "Colonel?" Owen nodded, resisting the urge to step away. "I see you're observing the proper ceremony today," the colonel commented, his eyes on the proceedings rather than on Owen. "Rather different when viewed with respect, isn't it?" Owen nodded, uncomfortable but unable to disagree. "I didn't understand," he admitted quietly. "I thought it was all just show. Just people playing dress-up." "A common misconception," the colonel replied, still watching the ceremony. "What you're seeing isn't pageantry for tourists, Mr. Fleming. It's tradition maintained through discipline, honour carried through generations. Every guard you mocked has served in combat zones, risked their lives, lost friends in service." The realization had been growing in Owen over the past weeks, but hearing it stated so plainly still struck him with unexpected force. "I didn't know," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. "Few do," the colonel acknowledged. "They see the uniform, the ceremony, the stillness. They don't see the man inside who's trained to endure, to stand firm, to represent centuries of service." He paused, finally turning to look at Owen directly. "Lance Corporal Harlow has recovered fully, in case you were wondering. No lasting effects from your interaction." As the ceremony continued, Owen found himself genuinely moved by the solemnity and precision on display. The rhythmic march, each footfall landing with metronomic precision on stones worn smooth by countless soldiers before them. The ceremonial rifle exchange executed with a precision that made the weapons seem to float between white-gloved hands rather than being physically transferred. The perfectly synchronized movements that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, of tradition handed down through generations, of standards that refused to bend to modern convenience or comfort. All of it communicated something his previous contempt had prevented him from seeing: dedication to something larger than oneself. In the measured pace of the guards, he now recognized not mindless adherence to outdated tradition, but the physical embodiment of values that transcended time: discipline, excellence, sacrifice, and honor. Each polished button and crisp salute served not as theatrical props, but as tributes to those who had worn the uniform before and would wear it long after. "Your community service ends next week, does it not?" the colonel asked as the ceremony concluded. Owen nodded. "Yes, though I've actually volunteered to continue for another month." The admission surprised even him. "Working at the Veterans Centre has been educational." "Respect isn't a matter of your opinion about which traditions hold value, Mr. Fleming. It's understanding that some things endure precisely because they connect us to values worth preserving." He straightened his already perfect posture. "I trust your remaining time in London will be more educational than your previous visit." As the colonel departed, Owen remained watching as the guards resumed their posts. Lance Corporal Harlow was among them, his bearing as impeccable as before. No one watching would have guessed this was the same man who had endured such deliberate disrespect weeks earlier. Owen observed from a respectful distance, no longer seeing a target for mockery, but a person whose dedication to duty had withstood far worse tests than an ill-mannered tourist. The lesson had been costly, financially, legally, and to his pride. But as he watched the guards standing firm against wind and weather, against distraction and discomfort, he recognized its value. Some lessons can only be taught through consequences. Some respect can only be learned through understanding what truly deserves it. What would you have done in Lance Corporal Harlow's position? Could you maintain such remarkable discipline in the face of such deliberate disrespect? Or what about as a bystander? Would you have intervened earlier or trusted the system to handle the situation? Tell us in the comments section below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the Royal Guards and the values they represent. Hit that bell icon to be notified when we upload new content. And share this video with someone who might appreciate this lesson in respect and consequences. Check out our other Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen right now, and we'll see you again tomorrow at the same time with another brand new video.